So we will call the meeting of the school committee finance subcommittee to order here at 7 a.m. Item of the agenda is discussion with the FY 27 budgets, and in this case, coordination with select board around one of the remaining items, which is kind of potential free cash allocation to special ed stabilization fund. I don't know who, if either of you, I should hand off to, or Nick, as relates to kind of, want to share your current thinking and status and kind of what you're looking for from the committee, in terms of feedback or direction.
I'll defer to the members. The select board discussed it at our last meeting, in terms of, kind of in two conversations. First one being supportive generally of free cash being used for reserves, although recognizing that Jay and Lauren have had conversations about maybe other potential uses. But the overall perspective from the select board was the appropriate place to appropriate that would be the sped stabilization fund. And I'll let Megan Winston obviously add any color commentary or correct me if I've misstated that conversation.
Yeah, I think if we go back to where we started with the $500,000 going into the sped stabilization fund is where we were. I know I said that if, given our discussion on the circuit breaker, if you were going to remain at the million, then perhaps the $500,000 was not going to be necessary for this year, and that $500,000 may be appropriated back to capital, or perhaps the amounts would be changed. I know that there have been changes in the school budget. I wasn't able to watch all of the warrant committee presentation last night, but I was able to watch you guys vote on your final, some of the presentations from the warrant committee. So I know that there have been changes. Obviously, the change from Title I, the director of nursing, some of those positions. So I think for our status on the sped stabilization fund, we just need some updates as to where you guys at with reserves. I know you've had to tap into some of those numbers a little bit more than you expected. I think probably a month and a half ago in our discussion. I think ideally we would want to keep that $500,000 in the sped stabilization fund. That's what the fund was created for, and that was the town administrator's initial recommendation. My thought of changing that was based on reserves and circuit breaker, but that was still in flux and subject to change. So that's kind of where I think I am right now.
Yeah, so I can just at least clarify or make sure we're on the same page of what we have changed to the point on circuit breaker since we and what the school committee decided since we last met in February, whenever that was. So as we worked through the budget process, again, we originally were drawing down an extra $200,000 from the circuit breaker. That was kind of built in within the baseline. We've since changed that to increase that by an additional $400,000 within next year to try and offset some of the impacts of the revenue shortfall and reduce the impacts of staff loss and operational losses for next year. So right now, in the current year, we're Katie kind of shared this within the slide we looked at last night with the warrant committee, but in the current year, we're projecting to utilize about $2.4 million of the circuit breaker. Next year, that's being increased to $3 million for the circuit breaker.
For next year?
For next year. Okay. For 26.
So we'll end the year with a balance of 1 point something million. Like we're projected to end the year with about 1 million, Katie, 1.1. So we've saved 1.1. We started with 8,000. We've saved our own 1.1. Instead of going over that, instead of having that plan be 3 years, pushing it out to 4 years to get it up to about 2.7 4 years. 2.7 represents about 75% of the 3.1, 3.4 that we're using as a target. Obviously, it will be more than that when we get to 4 years from now. It'll probably be more like $4 million, 75% of that. But so that's the projection. And that's the steps that we're taking. So at this table, we said that we would use some of those dollars to go towards taking some positions off the list, and we stretch it out over 4 years, but still have that strategy to fill the reserve. So that's exactly what we did.
And I think we heard this, but you didn't include any $500,000 appropriation into that calculation. That's without additional funding from others. Okay.
That 1.1, what was the number when we started out?
$8,700.
No, not for the year, but your expected savings for the first year. So,
This year doesn't change, it's the future years.
okay, so that 400,000 that was, they're saying was tapped into is reflected in next year's.
Correct.
Yeah, that's just increasing what we were planning on utilizing next year within the funds provided by the state.
We can pull up that chart.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Sorry, I should have that. There you go.
Slide 27.
Thank you. Share the screen. You know, okay, I think, can you all see this? Okay, mostly Megan,
Well,
because
it's actually, it's still saying, started screen sharing, but I'm not seeing any slides or anything.
still,
Nothing. Oh, there it is.
there it is, all right. Okay, yeah, this is the slide we presented last night at Warren Committee and talked about internally. So it has the kind of updated projections. As Katie said, there's nothing changing to FY26, the current year. We're kind of on budget, on pace, and those projections still hold. So nothing about FY26. What has changed is FY27, and obviously kind of the implications for future years. But that is the, again, increase up to $3 million of utilization that was originally last time when the original plan was 2.6 million. So that has increased to 3 million. So the circuit breaker is next year projecting to increase by around $500,000 of balance. We're still growing that balance, though at a obviously much slower rate, which is why it extends the timeline out to the 4-year period.
Can I give some context just so for folks who, we're recording this as well, so it's helpful. So these are all projections. So Katie knows the assumptions of these projections. So what this basically says, you start at the top. We started the year with $8,700. We, in right around October, got circuit breaker of $3.544 million. And we're only going to use 2.4 of that this year. Remember now, this is only one slice, and we talked about this last night, and Katie described this very well last night. This is only one slice of the market. There's local funds that go into this, and there's federal funds that go into this, and circuit breaker is a state funding mechanism that goes into this. So this is just that narrow slice of the circuit breaker part of it. The assumption is for this year, if we only use 2.4, we should end with 1.153. So hopefully we'll start next year with that number. It's still March, we're almost in April. We should be in good shape. We're assuming, Katie is assuming that in FY27, the reimbursement will be 3.5 because we're just using the same numbers. So you notice the 3.5 is all the way through. And we're also using and assuming that we only need 3 million to use in order to build this. So those are the assumptions that we're building that on. Anything could change in the middle. And I think this is why my opinion is the big picture strategy of having a plan like this should be solid guidance that we do every year. The small S strategy that we want to talk about in this is maybe, to someone's point, maybe we have a good year and everything's working and we only use 2.5 million of that circuit breaker. We can use more, or we want to put more in. It really depends on how the rest of the budget goes as well. So this is a lever that we use all the time, but this would be the game plan to get it to 2.7 within 4 years, with a lot of assumptions built in that every year is a unique animal that we have to respond to. But this is the hope, and if we have guidance to go by, we're more likely to stick to it than just saying we'll figure out each year. You don't want to just figure it out each year. You want to have a set of goals that you're aspiring to. So that's what that will look like.
Yeah, Megan.
So if I'm hearing correctly, so this is only state circuit breaker funds. And John, were you mentioning that there are potentially other sources of circuit breaker funds, like potentially from the federal government?
No, what I'm saying is we pay for those special education bills with circuit breaker funds from the state, local money from our local Milton budget, and also a small amount of federal funds. So there's three revenue sources that go into this big decision-making process of paying these bills. Circuit breaker is just one component of that.
Okay.
Just the one that we always talk about, but
So
it's
this
just
is-
one of the revenue streams.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
In terms of, just, I'm thinking about just your feeling on, if, let's say that this changes. If you receive 4 million next year in circuit breaker, are we doing like, you want to say the percentage of each year, or is it just kind of figuring out? Because we're going to do, in the budget coordination committee, are we going to do a 3-year projection? Are we saying we're going to try to save it percentage wise, or should we use it looking at it as a certain number that we're trying to hit, that we want to get to that 1 year?
I think our goal is to incrementally get to at least 75% of whatever the circuit breaker is in 4 years. That's the goal. That doesn't mean we have to get there next year. So I don't know. It's a good way to ask the question. Do we talk about the percentage of each year that we do, or do we talk about the end game? I think getting to the end game of having looking at that number of, well, we're always going to be at 75% of circuit breaker, then our year-to-year goals could change according to that. But I think that's the end game. So I didn't think of it year by year as much as I thought, let's get to the appropriate balance first, and then we can decide how we want to do that from year to year.
Yeah, and as a committee, we're looking to establish a policy that tries to lay that out clearly, just for ourselves and for the department and the public. I think, as an example of what you're saying, if we were to receive $4 million next year, the reimbursement rate we're receiving this year is higher than what we were projecting based on what we received last year, right? It went up. In some years, circuit breaker reimbursement has gone down, so it is not a linear upward line. So if you look at kind of history, Milton will go up by a little bit, it will go down based on actual expenses incurred. But if it were to go up next year, again, our FY27 budget is sound, assuming no other unexpected costs came in where we would need to utilize that, then this would grow at a faster rate. And so then what that would provide us is flexibility in FY28 to say, oh, all right, we're now, again, we got instead of $3.54 million, so this is now 2.1. So, we've actually gained an extra year. So now we can increase utilization to a greater extent in FY28 and produce further pressure on the town budget or the school budget request on the town and those out years. So I think that's kind of how we see that as working. As John said, these are some assumptions. We're making projections here, and each year we'll need to come back and say, okay, what is our current balance? What did we get from the state? What does this look like the next year? So budget cycle.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about in terms of strategy. If there was, we're just execution aids. But if there was more, that maybe we'd be able to put more into the operating budget, but it's still stay on police for 4 years.
That's the goal.
The tough part is if there's less, should change.
Yeah.
So we're open to that year-to-year conversation. Like that's a very healthy year-to-year conversation for us to have, as long as we're all agreeing that at a certain point in time, we all keep our eye on the goal mark of getting to a certain balance that we feel generally comfortable with. But that is the annual conversation we should be having.
Yeah, and then once we get to that balance, then I think the point Joe had made previously, we don't have to kind of hold an amount less than what we are expecting to receive from the state in order to build this up. We can just fully utilize the circuit breaker as we project for the next year and keep moving forward. Unless we obviously need to utilize it to a greater extent in a particular year and then have to build it up again.
Next year's reimbursement will be based on what we've spent this year.
Correct.
And we're in March. So I'm not trying to ask for the impossible, but we could have an estimate of what we'll be getting reimbursed last year because we know 3/4 of what we spent this year. Am I wrong?
It's more complicated than that, Jay, because what every district puts their bills into the state's formula.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the year, they stir it all up and they dispense those dollars that have already been appropriated by the state to match the dollars of about 75% of the cost of each one of these cases. But if the state gets flooded with reimbursement requests, maybe you only get 73% of it. because they only have a pool of money.
The governors said they intend to reimburse it 75% for next year.
Correct. But
And
when all the bills come in, then I think that's something that, well, Katie knows better than I. Go ahead.
so that's the intent every year is the 75%, and that's the same for tuition and transportation. And so the goal has been, and the funding has been to be able to reimburse at that full amount. Last year, tuition was 75%, transportation was only 47%.
Okay.
And that's why there was a supplemental budget passed at the state level to be able to, we received extra funding in July, and that was representative of the difference between the 75 and the 47. This year, the goal is 75%. We're only receiving reimbursement for 65% of our transportation costs. So it really depends on what expenses the rest of the state is submitting to be reimbursed on. We don't have control over that. So the intent is 75%. They can reimburse up to 75%. There's no guarantee.
When does it become like locked in? When do they make that announcement? Oh, it waits until October. Okay.
Yes.
So we go through the budget cycle, then they do the analysis.
Do you get the decision and the disbursement in the same month?
Yes. And that's why to have the previous year, that's a guarantee. So if we had a full year of circuit breaker, we would know, we'd already have that funding. We would know exactly what we can utilize for this year. Because we're in the cycle of, as soon as we receive the funding, it's already allocated, we're already spending it. So it's coming in and it's going out at the same time. It makes it difficult because we don't know, we're waiting until October to get those reimbursement amounts, and there's no guarantee what that number is going to be. So it makes it a little tricky when we're trying to budget.
So the percentage is unknown and the total eligible cost is unknown because it's only March. It's not June.
So,
But do we know if we're on track, higher, lower, similar?
so we've actually had a slight decrease in the number of students,
Okay.
and circuit breaker reimbursement is based on a threshold.
Yeah,
So the expenses have to exceed a certain amount. That amount changes year over year. And we've had a decrease in the number of our out of district students.
Okay.
And so I think I'd have to look at it a little bit further to say, if that 3.5 is still an
So it
accurate
might be
projection, yeah,
a little
because
lower.
that may change.
And so if we look back, right, to Mark's point, you say it's either, once in a while you'll have a dip. Most of the time it goes up incrementally. So the reasonable assumption from a financial perspective is just use what you've already experienced.
Yes.
And just have that be a conservative baseline. And then every year we learn and then so that's the reasonable tool that we're taking that most districts take.
Yes.
What did you get this year? Use that for your forecast this year.
Sorry, this is like staying right up at the table. This is just, again, to highlight the point that it changes, it can go up, it can go down. This is what it has been. So, it went down in FY 17, went slightly up, a lot up, went down in FY 21, slightly up, slightly up, went down in FY 25, has gone back up again this year. So it's not, again, a linear kind of growth, over time. The trend line is it's going up. Special education costs are more expensive to provide, even providing it to a little bit your students. But yeah, we think that utilizing or what we received in the prior year is an appropriate kind of estimate, given it could be less than that, it could be a little more than that.
Which speaks to having the balance, right? So then when you have that balance in it that we're aspiring to, if you're 300 short, you already have $2.7 million in the account, you can move that back and pay that. You can adjust every year. And that's the whole goal of that balance.
There was also some conversations, I think, at the state level, given the fact that this isn't just a Milton issue and not issue, but it's not just something that we're dealing with here. It's pretty much every district in the state. And so I think that there's been conversations about potentially advocating to increase the reimbursement from 75% to 90% in the future. But that, of course, depends on if the state can fund that or not. So I think as those conversations kind of continue, that's something that we would have to keep an eye on, because that could potentially change that amount in their projection as well. And that's something that I think, I would be advocating for that within my association kind of with the school business officials. And that's just something that there are so many things that happen with finances that are kind of out of our control. And so just something that we kind of have to continue to keep an eye on.
So again, I think the committee feels pretty good about, even though we are increasing utilization of circuit breaker and building that back, over a longer time horizon, which we appreciate the feedback from the select board and Jay, especially the warrant committee on just some of that as we were going through the budget process. I think we still feel good about where we're at for FY 27, or going to kind of build that long term, because as you all have noted, there's really no way for the town to directly support circuit breaker other than just put funds within our operating budget and thus utilize it less. So we have kind of mechanisms to build that. So I just want to name that too. Any further questions folks have on what our current strategies around?
None for me. I think we started this one of our plans was to have higher utilization, and that's happened. I didn't get a chance to hear from Jay the Warren Committee last night. I don't mean to make you repeat yourself, but if there's any you want to add to your feeling on
I don't know if I don't know if I achieved this, but my goal last night was when this subject came up to keep my mouth shut, because I wanted you to present to the rest of the warrant committee the situation, and they could hear it and make their own decisions. And they were, what I heard was that they were very positive about the plan you put forward.
I think I put myself in that positive category as well. So, same thing, Megan.
No, I appreciate the briefing on this and the transparency around the plan.
I just want to add that I think that it feels like when I arrived in June, that people were looking for systems and looking for strategy and looking for accountability measures within the school budget. And this is exactly that. Jimmy, that this is something that I think folks were looking for at the end of June, that we're trying to put those in place, and we have put those accountability measures in place. So this is what that looks like. This is one part of it.
I guess.
Yeah, Megan.
So, John, to your point, so I thought I heard Mark mention that there were going to be some policies that the school committee was going to set around the circuit breaker fund moving forward. Did I hear that correctly? And what is that going to look like? And I think maybe this isn't for discussion today, but maybe moving forward, we then can align like select board and school committee sort of understanding and collaboration around the circuit breaker policy, and how we think about applying free cash, or how the town would budget towards supporting this.
Yeah, so we've been trying to work on those policies. We started that kind of back in the fall, not just for circuit breaker, but for kind of our revolving accounts. Generally, as we've shared before, those were depleted kind of coming out of FY 24. And so how do we just make sure they are kind of in a sustainable place, circuit breaker being a key piece of that. So I think we've talked about as a finance committee to try and develop ones that's on our agenda, I think, for next week, now that we are somewhat past the FY 27 budget, but we have a voted on budget. We presented that to warrant committee. That is our next kind of charge for the remainder of this year. I think as John mentioned, like we've talked about is that I think the policy goal for the circuit breaker is what is kind of the minimum balance we want to keep within that? What's the process by the school department? Can withdraw funds below that, and what like notification approval do they need to provide the school committee, and things of that nature. We don't have the policy fully fleshed out yet.
Yeah.
To kind of share that with the select board in case they have like thoughts or feelings on it. But I think generally the goal is to provide guidance on, again, what is the amount we want to retain within the circuit breaker, and then how do we have kind of a conversation between the department and the school committee on, its utilization in moments where there are kind of significant unknowns, because right now those guardrails did not really exist in FY 24 when that occurred. So establish those.
Okay.
Megan, additionally, I think I've heard in a number of the school committee meetings also an ask for language around the special education fund and the meeting and how it would be dispersed. So we have that formalized as well. So I think that would be something for us as the board with Nick to put some language together about when do we meet, how do we decide on disbursements. So that's formalized as well.
Totally agree, and I can.
We have some
same things to share on that in a sec, but Nathan.
Winston took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say it would be great to kind of develop these two policies they are cousins of one another in a way, and it would be great to develop them in parallel or close to parallel. So that they, they're meant to address sort of different issues in slightly different ways, but just to make sure that they speak to one another and aren't in conflict with each other would be great. So thanks, Winston. I agree with that completely.
I agree, and I'm happy to get feedback on the select board on kind of how y'all think that process should go. I think Katie, I'm trying to share my screen again for the people online, so this might take about 15 minutes for you to see it. But Katie's just pulled together a few policies from other towns that, again, we have not reviewed yet or talked about at all at the finance committee, but that's one of the things we want to just talk about with y'all of kind of the process. Totally agree, Winston, and what Nathan made, that we should have a policy. We should make that clear for kind of both boards of how that works. And so she's trying to pull a couple examples that I think if it makes sense to the select board, school committees happy to kind of take the point on trying to create a draft. Obviously, we need to be a shared policy that y'all agree on, but we're going to take it through putting something together, sending that over to y'all, getting your feedback and trying to work to establish something. Given now, again, if y'all decide to put funds with using free cash into the special ed stabilization fund, I totally agree. We should have that, clear.
Yeah, I think we'd be okay with start with the draft.
Yeah. Always beg, borrow, and steal from other communities.
Absolutely.
So
Okay. I know again, y'all are balancing, just to get back to the free cash allocation, y'all are balancing a few things and a couple needs, and Jay has some thoughts on ideas for that too. And Jay, I don't know if you had things you wanted to.
Yeah, can you make me a participant or whatever I am?
I did it twice, Jay.
Well, yeah, but I wasn't paying attention.
Oh, Amy's on foot.
All right. Sharing not turned on.
Oh,
Mark,
sorry.
talk to you about sharing.
Everything you learn in kindergarten, apology for the rest of your life.
Okay. I will attempt to be quick.
No, Megan's got 5 minutes.
All right, quick. I know people keep saying, "Oh, we're talking about FY27, not about the forecast." No, real quick. We've got a forecast for the next few years. It has us coming out just perfectly at the end of FY29 when we might go for another override. I look forward to discussing this in greater detail with more people in this room. The assumptions for that forecast, and I'm highlighting some of the most important assumptions. In order for us to get to this forecast where we get through the next couple of years, you can look at the bottom. I'm assuming school salaries get 4.5% increase every year. Might say that's not enough, but it's what I could make work. And some of the scary assumptions, the first one that I have in the bullet point on top, I assume that we're getting $3 million in free cash for the next couple of years. Amy Dexter is now on. She will yell at me and tell me I can't assume that. Well, that is a scary assumption. State aid I highlighted, because state aid, if we're off by 1%, that costs us $400,000 over the next couple of years. Health insurance I highlighted, I'm assuming 7%. Forecasting health insurance is witchcraft. If I'm off by 1%, that's also off by $500,000. Those $500,000 might sound familiar. So when I'm thinking of what we do with this $500,000 that we're discussing, I want to do something with it that maximizes flexibility for the next couple of years so we can hit that second to last line item and give, appropriate a 4.5% increase for school salaries. Again, none of this is set in stone. It'll all change over the next month or so. But long story short, my point is let's put this somewhere that maximizes our flexibility. Maybe it's we leave it in free cash. If all the groups here agree we're going to leave it in free cash to maximize our flexibility, I think town meeting will go along with it. My thought was put it in capital stabilization, which to my mind is free cash by another name, because every year we take $1 million out of free cash and put it into capital. If we reduce that, if we take $500,000 from the capital stabilization instead of free cash, that gives us more free cash. Maximum flexibility would be to leave it in free cash. We agree and town meeting agrees. That gives us the most flexibility to get through the next couple of years. That's what I have to say.
I think I just maybe a helpful question from my mindset. Sorry, introducing it in a strange way. If you say there's $500,000 in sped stabilization fund, and I guess would the school committee consider that as part of your overall circuit breaker kind of reserve, or do you view that as a separate reserve that you could use for like extreme one-time costs to help you kind of remain on target for your overall circuit breaker goal? Like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, would you want to try to use it all in 27 so that at the end of 27 there's $500,000 more in circuit breaker if the free cash is in the sped stabilization fund? Would you rather like try to leave it there to use if you get unexpected costs to remain on track for your other circuit breaker goals? Does that question make sense?
Can I start? I'll start. So the special education stabilization fund, the way that I've always looked at it and the way that the language is written in the statute is that the stabilization fund is a reserve fund to pay for unanticipated or unbudgeted costs. And so that's different from circuit breaker. We use circuit breaker as a funding mechanism for costs that are known. So when we're building the budget, we're using circuit breaker kind of as an overall funding mechanism for students that we know, services that we know, just at a projected cost increase for the upcoming fiscal year. Special ed stabilization fund is for those expenses that happen during the course of the fiscal year that you haven't budgeted for, but are impactful. And the purpose of the stabilization fund is really to stabilize the budget. So if we have an expense that's $400,000 that we didn't have funding for or that we didn't budget for, we have a mechanism that we can use that there is money to cover that one-time expense that we do not have to impact the rest of the budget. We don't have to freeze hiring. We don't have to tell teachers that they can't use any more copy paper. We can just use that stabilization fund, and then that expense then becomes known, and then you have to build it into your budget for the next year. And so I typically would not use the stabilization fund as a budgeting mechanism, because if you are, that's for known costs. We budget based off of known costs. This is for the unanticipated, unbudgeted costs that come in during the course of a fiscal year. We use that one-time money, and then you have to roll that expense into your budgeting moving forward.
So to that point, if in 27 and 28 you have $250,000 each year in unanticipated costs,
yep,
in a regular year without a sped stabilization fund, you'll have to eat that within your budget, take it out of circuit breaker or what. This will just give you a lever to perhaps remain on target with what we just discussed about in circuit breaker. So
correct.
I do think at the end of the day, it still provides a lot of flexibility for the town budget as a whole, because it's a lever for schools to be able to balance, remain on your circuit breaker target. Then that allows the overall budget to still kind of hit some of our goals without too much of an impact. So I appreciate Jay's point in terms of flexibility for the entire budget. I feel like this does provide helpful flexibility for the school budget, which still also helps the overall town budget if, in 27, 28, you have the unanticipated costs and you're able to still hit your other targets, still be able to use $3 million a year in the general budget, rather than, oh my gosh, we had a massive increase, so we're gonna have to use $2.7 million less in circuit breaker in fiscal 28. Now, town's gotta either step up to provide that balance, or you have to just reduce your expenses. So I agree. I think it still does provide that flexibility overall.
I think I would push back a little bit in that, if, you know, again, not going into the details of my forecast, but it depends on taking $1 million of free cash and putting it into the operating budget stabilization fund every year. And if we have some release on the school budget, I don't see how that directly affects the free cash, which we're putting in the operating budget stabilization fund, which we're using, you know, we're using that. We don't want to use one-time funds for ongoing expenses. So if we want the school budget to go up 4.5% a year, if that's what we want, we need the free cash to go to the operating budget stabilization fund. I don't quite see how it gives
My
us
point
that
is-
flexibility.
If in a year where they plan to spend $3 million out of circuit breaker, they have to spend $3.3 million out of circuit breaker, that means for the next budget year, town budget or other has to come up with an extra 300 grand, or alternatively, they have to reduce their expenses by 300 grand. So I think it's all going into, it's not quite going to the same pot, but it also does all contribute to overall flexibility and resources. I think it would be, for a direct line, in your view, I agree, it would be cleanest and most kind of directly into the operating budget stabilization fund to support the whole budget. I think this version over here, it still kind of accomplishes the same mechanisms, in my view. And obviously it's a broader policy kind of choice, but I worry less about that aspect of it in terms of future flexibility, because I think it helps the schools maintain what they expect to withdraw from circuit breaker each of those years.
Maybe this will be defined in our policy on the special education fund. We talk about unexpected expenses. If you get, let's say you get a particularly expensive placement, maybe halfway through the year, that's the sort of thing that we go to special education stabilization, right? Even if it goes circuit breakers or something like that.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if, to Jay's point, that if an example would be that the 500 went into the special ed stabilization account of FY 27. And as we get ready for FY 28 and we're walking our way through FY 27 and we're all on target, and the 500 actually just stays there, because actually all the dominoes fell in the right direction. We had no surprises, and our plan is working, and maybe that 500 stays there untouched, and it's actually it's the insurance policy for FY 28. And then when we're budgeting for FY 28, to your point, Jay, we don't need to put any more money back in there. Now you can start to use your free cash in a strategic way to support the 4.5. And if it's never utilized, meaning if it's not utilized because we're making it work on our side, that's just an insurance policy that sits there. And then the future budgets and operating with the use of free cash, to your point, in order to support overriding, could actually happen. You know, it's a kind of, it could be a both.
That's what I've been assuming, but I still feel like it doesn't help in the sense that if we're assuming health insurance is a 7% inflation and it's 8% inflation, that's $500,000 that we're short overall. And having $500,000 in the special ed stabilization fund might help in a very roundabout way, but it doesn't help in the way that having free cash you can spend on anything.
Yes, no, that's fair. It's a good, hopefully that's a good problem that we have. You know what I mean? And I agree that it's good thinking, and we should just be thoughtful about how we want to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's not maximum flexibility, but I do think it does contribute to flexibility for the next couple of years.
And that's the same debate that we have internally from a very school perspective, right? We want maximum flexibility by having the 500, because we're worrying about all these things in our own organizational world. Your organizational world, which is a bigger responsibility, is you're trying to do that for the whole town. So we have similar philosophies of it. And none of it's bad. It's just like how you look at the work.
I am, but one of the reasons I want the maximum flexibility for the town is so that we can give the school more.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Oh.
No, we agree. I just think it's just good to point out that we're all trying to use the money in a way that's flexible, supports the budgeting, has some reserves. This is a very good, positive conversation to have. So thank you.
Jump in with my thoughts. I think I don't particularly, might be surprising, like have super strong feelings on exactly where the 500,000 goes, I think, again, our desire of building kind of back to the circuit breaker and having that flexibility in the budget, I think we have a good plan as we just showed y'all for that. And I think that, in my mind, makes the other things less less necessary. Again, 500,000 would certainly help as a backstop, because we saw years in which there was significant impacts of special education spending, and then that affecting other parts of the town. And so that's not what we want. And that's what the special ed stabilization fund is intended to help address. If that funding is kept elsewhere within the town budget, and the town administrator and the select board and the warrant committee are all aligned that given we don't have that funding within the special ed stabilization fund, that if the schools need it, they would instead need to go to the operating stabilization fund or the town reserve account, whatever those other mechanisms are. Like, that's fine, potentially, because that funding is still kind of there to support whatever those needs are. It's just a matter of, I think, that the idea of the special ed stabilization fund is that's really clear for whoever the elected members are, given we change, whoever the warrant committee members are, and for the town as a whole of this is where you go when you have that. It's not, necessarily like the schools have totally failed and messed up their budget. It's like there's some unexpected costs they come here. And I think that, that my concern would be if that funding is not there and we have to go to the select board as a whole, the town as a whole, to get some type of additional free cash allocation or out of these other accounts that would be looked at like, oh, why didn't you manage it when we're, within this conversation, making a clear decision like that we're not going to put it and like create these reserves in that account. So that's just something I just want to name. I do think, Jay, like a goal, we've talked about this as like belt and suspenders approach within the circuit breaker and the stabilization fund. It doesn't help to have belt and suspenders if you don't have any pants, right? And so like if we are going to continue to not be able to have a revenue increase for the school department that actually allows for the operations to continue, that does feel like a baseline kind of need. I'm not 100% sure if we are at a place where these projections have you shown like that everybody's agreed upon and that we're really clear on how the 500,000 would allocate. Because I don't know if the town's agreed upon like the 3% salary increase. Obviously, the town's budget this year is going up for level service at like 3.7. 4, and there are things where like salaries are actually a little bit lower than a standard year. So I just think that's the other piece. And so I'm rambling a bit here at the end. I generally defer from my perspective on the select board, town administrator, warrant committee, if you all have strong feelings on how you think can best be used to provide flexibility to the town as a whole, but just want to make sure that's done within the context of like without having a special ed stabilization fund. If the schools do come in that situation, such as we had 2 years ago, it is not unexpected that we would need to come to y'all for those funds through other avenues, such as free cash or reserve accounts.
Well, I hate to be greedy, but when you say put it in an account that you could get if you need it, to me that says reserve fund, which is supposed to be for unexpected expenses. Like when the Glover water heater broke, y'all could have come to us and said, we didn't expect the water heater to break, give us $90,000. And maybe we would have said yes. But again, as you're saying,
Tucker, I had like 4 of those this year.
As you're saying, put some lines around it, put an extra $500,000 in the reserve fund with some sort of acknowledgement that if there's if the poop hits the fan for special ed account, you come to it. Otherwise, it flows to free cash the next year. The reason I say greedy is because it's one of the few things the warrant committee actually does is allocate that money. But that's not my motivation. I don't know if there's a better place, something like that.
No, I mean, I think they're all good options, whether it's the operating budget stabilization fund, whether it's the sped stabilization fund, whether it's the reserve fund. I think we're all in agreement of putting the money away to support, unexpected needs and also future needs. So I don't know that there's any right or wrong answer. I think having the kind of overall consensus to put this somewhere for those purposes. Good, just whether there's a perfect place for that.
I think the advocacy from the school department, I can only speak for myself, but when we talk about expenses, we're not just talking about like water heaters and elevators, we're talking about kids. And the kids aren't going away. And these are services that they they need, and we can't, when I think about a budget, I can't think about a budget based off of maybe I'll give you the money, like, I need to know
Oh, I see. I
that
see.
we're going to be able to allocate funding, because this is a student that has like a significant need, and that comes with a significant cost. So I think just, I can't advocate anymore for it to go to a special education stabilization fund or a circuit breaker, because these are real costs, they're students, they're significant, and we just want to make sure that we can budget appropriately, again, so we don't have to impact the overall operations of the school.
Special ed stabilization fund allocation would memorialize the intent that's being discussed and shared here by everybody in the conversation, that this is intended to provide the stabilization for the schools, which in turn supports the town. Because to everybody's point, I mean, if it goes back into the town pot overall, then we might have them watch this meeting on, the YouTube to remind us that was intended to support the schools, but there's, doesn't actually, it could be a wide open conversation again a year from now or 2 years from now. So I think that, if Nick, you're saying that it's, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you seem to be saying you're sort of agnostic on like the ultimate destination of the money. The intent would be the same, to provide some stabilization to the school's budget in turn to support this town stabilization. So I think,
that's always been.
yeah, right. So I feel like just the special ed stabilization fund is there to just make it clear that the goal of that reserve was that.
And I guess my response would be that we look through history, the town of Milton, the highest, let's lump them all together, circuit breaker and special education. The highest it's ever been is 1.5 million. Well, this summer we're going to be at 1 million. Next summer we're going to be higher than we've ever been at 1.8 million or whatever.
Project.
Sure. So I feel like as far as like dire risk, we've got that risk covered. I feel like.
It's
Okay,
just,
it's never covered. So then I'm looking at other
I would
risks.
challenge as well. I think
Okay.
with the special education fund, I think we can't lose sight of why it was created and what we have coming into this year, coming off of the override and that massive increase in special education. I don't think we can assume that there won't be another great rise. Similarly to Nick projecting out insurance at 10%, because we had that, what could have been a great cliff if insurance went up. So I think for special education funding, we may need at least another year or two before we can say that it's going to be at a certain level, unless it continues to balloon. So I think we're trying to seriously have that support with the special education fund and reserves to see what the next year or two looks like, because that's what got us to that cliff with the override and then massive rise. Like that's what I saw in that chart that you all showed, was the change in the money going out in 2024, seeing that $1.5 million difference and why things went to zero. So I think we don't need more time before we can say the special education costs are going to.
I think one of the other changes that was significant too for circuit breaker was previously they didn't include our reimbursement for transportation. So the transportation reimbursement is somewhat new. And so when we look at the history and some of the funding levels and the utilization of circuit breaker, that was based off of only being reimbursed for tuition costs, not transportation costs. And so if you look at the history, the funding levels and the utilization, it's based off of kind of a different model of how circuit breaker was being provided to the town. So I think we would have to continually update our thinking, because now it's transportation included in the tuition. And I had mentioned earlier, there may potentially be an increase, which would benefit us all communities. So it's not, our circuit breaker now is not the same as circuit breaker was 10 years ago.
Maybe this is not possible, but if we're saying the risk is not covered, I'd like to see some numbers. Like, here's a reasonable number of, we might assume one high cost kid is going to appear. What is a high cost kid? Give me some numbers. Or it might be reasonable to prepare for two high cost kids appearing. Give me some numbers. We're just talking sort of vague here. And between now and next Monday, that may not be possible, but I would have liked that if we're going to determine what the risk is.
Like the average of a placement, or 'cause I think my understanding is the costs are very different. You know, needs, where you're going.
What I mean is, what kind of increase in costs should we, what one standard deviation increase in costs?
And it's not the increase, it's the placement. So when we talk about, I'm not talking about percentage increases, when I'm talking about unanticipated costs.
Okay.
It's the fact that a student could move here from anywhere. And we would have to pay for their tuition expense. Some expenses are up to $600,000 for the year. And then also the transportation, which in some instances runs $900 a day.
So we think it's reasonable to prepare for one of those, 1, 2. I mean, I want to put some numbers around it,
So.
which we may not do in the next 2 minutes.
I think we are putting numbers around it, but I also think that I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anyone at this team.
It's also, I think so I respect the numbers version of this, but to Katie's point earlier, it's also, it's a child thing too. And
Yes.
and this is recorded, and this family's looking at this and they're connecting themselves to these numbers, and it gets really hard to talk about it in a sensitive way. There are cases, and this year was one where there were 2 potential $600,000 cases.
Okay.
One of which we ended up paying and absorbing.
Okay.
One of which was partially paid, and then that placement changed in the fall.
Okay.
And therefore that expense fell off the town and went to.
That's a good example.
So that those were 2. So we were, the reason why we were really working hard to not build vacancies is we knew we had $1.2 million of new potential costs in July of this year.
That's a very good
And we
example.
had $8,000 in that account. So that's why we got nervous, and that's why we acted appropriately to build insurance within our own budget to handle that. Luckily, one of those, that service delivery got funded by the state because of a lot of different reasons, and the other one we're paying for. But if that happened in October, that would be the example. Would say, holy moly, to Katie's point, child X just moved in. This is what their IEP says. This is what we have to fund. This is a bill. This is not a, how do we you don't negotiate these things. They are what they are, the logic there. And so that would be an example. So those are extreme. Some of them are more like 300,000. They might be 250, transportation and tuition. And so that would be what one concrete that happened in FY 26.
Okay.
We're happy to be supporting them.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
Yes.
I think that's the reason.
And I
for the
think,
need
yeah,
to
and
kind of
everybody
keep
is
that
the
in perspective.
best way to work around it. So, and, when those things fall this way, that way, when all the money is in circuit breaker, we move that lever at the end of every year and say, hey, this happened, and a couple of things fell in our favor. We can save more circuit breaker. We don't need as much circuit breaker. That's the year-to-year level that we want to be able to talk about as a group. How did we experience the last year? Where are we at? And then to Winston's point, once we get to that 2.7 number, we're really not talking about adding anything anymore. We're really talking about, to your point, using all the money in the budget for the town and the schools in the way that's best for the operating. So I think we have a couple of years to get there. But I think that this discussion has been very healthy, and I appreciate the support.
I guess I'm looking at the time, it's 9 o'clock. Next Monday, the warrant committee is gonna have to make a decision. I was hoping we'd come to a consensus.
Where to place it.
Want to put in $500,000. I would say we have not.
Well, it seems like there is a consensus, maybe just with the exception of you.
What would you say the consensus? Oh, Amy Dexter has her hand up.
Amy. Take your check.
So I'm just going to chime in with my opinion, even though I support putting it in the sped stabilization fund. I think it's a good compromise. It gives the school the flexibility in case of an emergency to use it without having to go to town meeting, which if we come up with a situation where we need it right away, that's an expensive proposition to have to go to town meeting to get it out of a regular stabilization fund. So I think it's a good place to put it. It shows the town support for the Milton Public Schools and our kids. And it gives the transparency, I think, that some families and residents have been asking for regarding the school budget. So that's just my opinion. I would support putting it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Nathan or Anna, just to sure, if y'all have any thoughts, no pressure, but any thoughts or opinions to share. School committee obviously is not an official vote on what we think should happen with 500. We have talked about it a bit. Nathan?
Nothing substantive to add. I heard somebody, I think it was Lizzie, say that we felt like there was consensus in the room between select board and school committee, but I wasn't actually, and I haven't heard every single word. Some parts of the conversation have been a little muffled, but if we could recap what the consensus in the room is, that would be useful for me because I wasn't actually sure that there was consensus.
Yeah, I also don't want to make Winston speak for the entire select board.
That's true. Yeah.
I'll say for me right now on the board that I think we want to put special education stabilization. From the conversations I've had with other board members, I think they would also be supportive of that. We would not know until our next meeting, but that's where I think we'd be leading. Since that's where we started, that was the intent of the fund. That's been the bulk of our conversation about putting it in the special education stabilization fund with the select board also. Administrator Milan.
I think that captures the conversation that the board had last week where Winston was the one who said, well, just to be clear, the warrant committee has had some questions about alternative pathways, but the rest of the board been talking about what to do with the $500,000 in terms of if it was going to support the schools. Was certainly consensus that if it would go into a stabilization fund. That was the piece that there was clear consensus.
And one of my biggest personal reasons for that fund is that because we'll put language around it that the committee and the select board have to meet. It forces us to have conversations when costs of us. So it is a built-in mechanism where you see things going a little bit out of scope that we have to sit with each other and have this conversation. And that's one of the big benefits for me is I think, as we've all seen in this budget cycle where we're all going through it together, the more we're able to talk, the more we're able to come over this stuff.
If I agree with putting it in the stabilization fund. And I also think that Jay's thinking on making sure that it's a lot more accessible. My hope, Jay, to lean into your thinking is that if we put it in there for FY27, we're hoping to not have to utilize it. We're hoping that we can handle our own business. If that's fit, 500 stays as a $500,000 figure, or even a $400,000 figure carrying the 28. Then the free cash conversation that you're talking about can happen. We don't have to add to that again. If we're working both sides of this issue, one on the school side, having this as a safety net, then in 28 and 29, if that all holds true and the plan is working, then your idea about free cash being more flexible use in 28, 29 to support the school budget or to support other budgets of the town. I think it could be a both and situation. So I appreciate you thinking like that. I just want to acknowledge that and say it out loud. And I think that after we get over a certain hump, we can actually do that year to year. But that your vision can be true in 28 and 29 if we are able to put some money aside to have a safety.
Yeah, I'm sorry Megan dropped off. Obviously, I can't speak for Megan, but she's the one who raised to me that my forecast might or might not be realistic, but it's a little precarious. It's subject to fluctuations of health insurance, et cetera. So I'm trying to put together a forecast that will support the schools in addition to the rest of the town. And it's put in danger. I'm not saying $500,000 will, save or destroy anything, but I worry that it's being a little short-sighted. But we'll have this discussion at the warrant committee. I mean, the warrant committee is going to make a recommendation to town meeting. We are not looking to go rogue. And I'm hoping that members of the school finance committee will be there on Monday. I'm hoping that members of the select board finance committee members will be there on Monday. We're not looking to go rogue and chart our own paths. We want to work together with the two big affected boards. Yeah. And I worry that it reduces our flexibility. But again, $500,000 may not make or break anything.
Yeah, I mean, again, I personally defer a lot to the town, Amy and Nick, as to like how they also, again, I think are looking at these projections and what they are. We need to split the difference here and find like 300 to one, 200 another. I don't know. The 500 amount in and of itself too is sacrosanct. For us, I don't want to speak for anybody else. It's not necessarily sacrosanct to me, so I don't know if that makes a difference.
You mean
The full 500
Yeah,
and terms of like that.
Yeah.
And if that is a lever that then allows for board consensus, again, if we got 300,000 within the special ed stabilization fund, that's more than the town has ever had within that account. And we can talk about adding 200,000 next year and do it a little bit more of an increments. If there are concerns, it's an idea. I would look a lot to kind of Amy and Nick as we talk about those projections, and hopefully we'll have further conversation within the budget coordination committee on Monday on how appropriate are these projections, how tight are they, what are the ways in which we are adjusting them to be able to.
If I can say real quick also, I think, I don't know if this will happen by Monday. Well, it won't happen by Monday, but I'd feel a lot better about putting money into that account if we had a policy like the one you showed up on the screen real briefly. Like, it's going to come out when special education numbers exceed whatever. Otherwise, I mean, you're going to hear the word slush fund if we just put money in. So
I don't think we get accused of a slush fund, a fund that's legally.
There's a statute.
There's a statute.
well,
That's the only place.
the warrant committee is better behaved this year than in previous years, but
All right. It's good.
you would have for
I think, to add to Mark's point, we just said the $500,000 number as what Nick presented, but we're capped at 1.2, and 2%. All right.
Yeah, there's a maximum.
But to the point about policy, we didn't talk about if we actually want to get to it. Right? This started with, as a way to support the schools, put $500,000 into the fund. No intention of adding next year. We had not spoken about that or in previous years. So are we agreeing that we want to keep it at 500,000? That policy that was up there for, I think it was to pass it, their maximum was 500,000, their floor was 100,000. We haven't set that. So we want to also put that in the policy. It's like, don't want to keep it at $500,000, or do we want to get to the actual 2%? I think.
And again, this is another one. This is Bedford. Their cap and minimum are obviously different. So I do think it's something that varies between towns. I don't think at this point I can say for the school we just haven't talked about it. Obviously, haven't talked to you all about it. So I do think it'd be nice. We already have this policy, Jay. To your point, we don't. We need to develop it. So that does affect kind of some of the long-term vision of how we want to fund this over time.
But I think if you could share those and then be to us and to Jay, I think at least he'll be able to say some more. A lot of these have them in the school committee and select board talking about adopting a version of this and taking the best ideas from.
Any other feedback, thoughts from folks online? Nathan?
Just a thought on this question of policy, Jay. I think it is a fair point that even though sped stabilization is a sort of has legal authorization, it's a fair point to say, okay, we're putting money in without a policy on how we're going to take it out. I think it's highly unlikely that that policy, I think it is unlikely that that policy will be created by Monday. But, and I don't know what people in the room would think, but if we could we create that policy in advance of town meeting? And be prepared to share it at town meeting so people understand how it's going to be used. Warrant committee could take it on faith that that is going to get done, and probably the policy will look like some of these that Mark has shared with how things go in, how things go out, floors and ceilings. And you know, if warrant committee isn't happy with how the policy is developed, you can always green sheet it. I don't know what's reasonable within the next, you know, it's like 2 months or 6 weeks or something. So, you know, we should be realistic about what we commit to.
Anna?
Hey, I just had just a clarifying question. The money that would get put into this special ed stabilization fund, what would that, like, could you give me some examples of what that could be used for potentially versus what we would use circuit breaker for?
You can use it for tuition, special education tuition costs. So if we had a student move in, or if we had a student even change placement. So if they are currently attending a collaborative school and they change and are attending a residential school, there's a pretty significant cost increase. That would be a use of the fund. Just anything special education related that we did not budget for in the current operating budget or with the current circuit breaker funding is would be an example of a cost for the stabilization fund. And similar with transportation, if we had a student that say currently goes to school in Milton and then is placed out of district, we could also use the stabilization fund to cover that transportation cost.
So then what happens like the next year? So if we were able to do that for 1 year, it would be a reoccurring cost, right? If the placement changes or transportation changes?
Correct. And then the next year, you just have to build that into the budget. So it would be a part of the budget that is funded by the operating budget and in part by circuit breaker and our federal grant.
Okay.
Yes.
And then if, for instance, could that money be used for like if you needed to hire another position within the school or no? Or is it strictly for out of district placement and transportation?
For the stabilization fund, you're not supposed to utilize the fund until after you have an actual invoice. And I think just if I think about operationalizing it with payroll, because it's an ongoing expense, I think it typically wouldn't be used for a payroll expense because we'd have to go, it'd be meeting every 2 weeks to approve the expense between the select board and the school committee.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask Anna's question about the ongoing expense? Brought up one thing that I feel like has been missing in this conversation. I know it's 9:15, I'm sorry. Let's say we have a $600,000 placement this year. That costs us $600,000 this year. Next year, and I'm just riffing on numbers, next year the state will give us $400,000 for that kid, right? Making up numbers. So it was a $600,000 hit in the first year, 1/3 as much the next however many years. So I sort of feel like that's something that's been missing from this conversation. And
I think Katie said it pretty well a few moments ago. The reason to reach out into the stabilization fund is in the year that is an unpredicted cost that we have to go into that account and have that money, leave the pressure on that. But then now that expense is in the budget, now it's predictable. It is predictable for next year. That child is 13 years old. They'll be with us until they're 22. So that expense now goes into the predictable planning for our next year's circuit breaker funding and our budget. So it'll become part of the bigger piece of what we're planning. These stabilization accounts is for things that are not predictable that may have happened in the course of the year. So once it becomes part of our expenses, then we can say to everybody, hey, this child is part of our cohort, folks, it needs to be funded next year, and they'll just be built into the traditional year-to-year expenses. Whether that makes the number go up or down, whatever that means, but that'll be part of the predictable.
And that's why it's important to have multiple funding sources, right? That's why, from a budgeting perspective, that's why we talk about stabilization. We talk about operating and we talk about circuit breaker, because it's unanticipated this year, because known next year, and we would have different pockets of money to be able to handle those expenses. Right now, we pretty much just have the operating budget. We didn't have any circuit breaker. We don't have a stabilization fund. And so that's really difficult because you have one source of money. We're trying to make it so that there are pockets of money for different expenses at different times that we can rearrange so that it helps with our financial stability and it helps with our long range planning.
It seems to me that most of this conversation kind of run its course. I think Winston is talked to the members of the school select board and obviously whatever involvement kind of have coordination between them and the warrant committee. Will happen. I totally agree your point on kind of timeline. I think the school side, I think we've shared our thoughts. I'll pause for a sec just to make sure there's nothing else from members online. Okay. That's that. Then I think we'll wrap up that. Fortunately, we really appreciate Nick, Amy, Winston. Thank you all for coming.
I'm sorry, can I be the guy and ask an unrelated question?
Yeah.
The Title I funding, and I guess I'm just curious if you've had thoughts about a game plan on that, or if that would be a place where you'd be looking for additional funding support. In the town budget or still early.
It's not 100% yet, but they can restore warning. That's pretty rare. We are committed to making it work within whatever funding we have.
Okay.
If anybody wants to give the 135 and put it on the table to make sure it happens, we plan on keeping that service report that we will make that. Here we go.
All right, that's all. Thank you.
For the
Thank you for asking.
Yep.
finance committee, for the schools, and I'm standing that note as well. We have our next meeting scheduled for Wednesday, as we meet every week. I'd love to see you meet so often. I think on the agenda is discussion of draft revolving accounts policies. And we've pushed that down as we work on the budget stuff. That some of that document that we kind of work on in fall and
Yeah.
is that a place where next week we think we can talk about it?
Yeah.
Okay. Would also be helpful. I mean, I can also look at these policies and try and contribute. Create a working draft for stabilization.
We can do that too. I can work on that too. So next week would be revolving fund and stabilization fund.
Yeah, I think it's, the circuit breaker is part of, and then all the other revolving accounts stabilization. I think generally the development of those policies is what we're trying to get done here now. The end of the school year.
I think just based off of this conversation, prioritizing stabilization circuit breaker probably
Yes.
would be the best.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just for process, so, and Anna, I hope it's okay if I go ahead and ask this question, but this is a unique situation because we're talking about a financial policy.
Mhm.
And so for that reason, I'm wondering if it actually makes sense to work through. You can work through it at finance. I mean, a scenario would be that you could work through it first at finance, but just to flag that the policy subcommittee is also responsible for policy. So I think that maybe it's something where we need to be doing more work at the joint, like the full meetings rather than subcommittees, either or. Anna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think my hope would defer really to not trying to keep this in finance, so I think this needs to be policy, that's fine. I just generally think whichever subcommittee should just work with John and Katie to get a draft and then that draft and like generally get feedback from that, group of 3 members, refine that a little bit, and then, obviously, any policy needs to come through. I think we can, more than some of the policies we talked through were really just like a reading. It's a pretty kind of standard policy. I'd anticipate we want to have for more discussion than other policies when we bring this to full school committee, and might need more than even just 2 rounds of meetings to get that feedback. Obviously, also, I think to your point, we do cross post the finance ones, we cross post the policy ones. I think, in my mind, finance makes more sense just because we meet more regularly.
Yeah.
It's like the working group to try and get something together. But would love to have any and every member attend that, just so that then folks feel
Yep,
involved
fair.
and connected. But definitely don't want to step on toes of other members here and things like that. That makes sense to you, Anna. As the chair of that.
And there's also a little urgency to expedite it, right? In order to inform the warrant committee
Absolutely.
to do our due diligence to support the timing of them going to town meeting warrant to make sure that they bill. Just some concrete language being discussed.
That seems like a reasonable goal,
Yeah, I agree.
you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
you said. Or I guess Nathan said, to have a policy in place by town meeting,
Yeah.
that's feasible.
Yeah, I agree.
And one of our goals from the start of the year is to create these policies before the end of the year. So we're gonna get there. All right. Anything else we need to discuss on the next Wednesday? Or obviously, at a certain point, we'll need to put on the list the town meeting presentation, but that's a few weeks out from that probably.
So I can let Charlie know, special education stabilization fund policy discussion. I'll just walk over it and circuit breaker policy discussion, and then I'm gonna add some other revolving account, because we might take this. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Any other questions? Things we should discuss on the agenda? If not, then I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I will second it. All in favor, Nathan,
Yes.
and I'm a yes, so we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.